In 1932, voters did not so much vote for FDR as against Herbert Hoover. They didn't know very much about FDR. He was born in 1882 to a family, the Roosevelts, descended from the 17th century Dutch gentility who had estates along the Hudson River back when it was New Holland. The patroons, they were called. He was descended from them. And by the 1880s, Hyde Park Manor, the Roosevelt family seat, had been in the family for over 200 years. His mother's family, the Delanos, were no less distinguished, and they were descended from Mayflower voyagers. He went to Groton, Harvard College, Columbia Law School. He was a blue blood. The Roosevelts were wealthy, but not fabulously so by late 19th century or Gilded Age standards. Their family net worth was about $1 million, a fortune in the depths of the Depression, but not nearly like that of a robber baron. The Roosevelts were very concerned, rather, about wealth stratification and the nouveau riche. They deplored vulgar ostentation, the kind displayed by the Vanderbilts and so forth. Teddy Roosevelt, an older cousin, had obviously concurred. And yes, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is related to Teddy Roosevelt. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt was young Franklin's hero. And he set out to do, and curiously now, Teddy, of course, was a Republican. FDR will become a Democrat. But nevertheless, he admired TR and set out to duplicate his career, which was this: New York Assemblyman, serving in the New York legislature, Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He did that as well. Recall that it was as Assistant Secretary of the Navy that TR sent Dewey to the Philippines. He then became governor of New York. And then Teddy Roosevelt, of course, became vice president, then vice president. For FDR, it happened almost exactly like that, except he was a state senator, not an assemblyman. He was in the upper house, and he lost his 1920 vice presidential bid. He was the running mate for Al Smith. In 1921, at the age of 39, he contracted polio and eventually lost the use of his legs. Before this, he was charming but undistinguished, focusing on parties, sailing, womanizing. The 2 years he spent bedridden seemed to galvanize him. It was one of the best things that ever happened to him. It was the best thing that ever happened to him. He developed compassion for those who suffered. His illness also transformed his relationship with his wife, Eleanor. Obviously, he didn't think much of her during his years of partying and womanizing, but he needed her in this period of convalescence, and he welcomed her as a partner, an equal partner, and she soon displayed a talent for public speaking, political organizing. She would be the most outspoken, visible First Lady yet. Now, FDR was governor of New York from 1929 to 1933, basically elected in 28. So he initiated, perfect timing, he initiated various reform programs as governor of New York to help deal with the Depression, and their success made him the front runner for president. But the nomination looked far away, however. For years, the Democrats had gone back and forth between the Southern and Midwestern progressive model, who promoted social justice but were socially conservative. This left column here. Think, for example, of someone like William Jennings Bryan, okay? Socially conservative, but believed the government should be active to help the poor, the farmers, so forth. And the other half of the party, which were controlled by, we'll call Northeastern ethnics, people that would have supported were supported by the Jews and the Irish and the Germans in these urban centers. Think Al Smith of New York. And these Northeastern ethnics were very conservative economically, believed the government should not step in and do a lot. They were very, very laissez-faire. You'll recall maybe Grover Cleveland was very laissez-faire in the 1890s. He was from New York, a former New York governor. But this group were social liberals. They believed the government should stay out of people's personal lives as well as out of economics. So FDR saw the need to take up a middle stance. So as governor, he surrounded himself with advisors who embraced a new reform movement called liberalism. Liberalism was interventionist in economic matters. Government should do things to help people in economic distress, but libertarian on personal ones. Government should stay out of people's lives. So FDR took this aspect and this aspect and united them in what is known as liberalism, and that's what we mean by liberal today. FDR essentially invented that and forged that liberal coalition, which largely exists today. The Democratic Convention in 1932 appeared to be a competition between several men who ultimately realized they had to achieve party unity to win the general election, and the party closed around FDR. He flew from his home to Chicago to give a speech in person to accept the nomination, the first person ever to do so in party history. This was the speech in which he promised, quote, a New Deal for the American people. The only specific promises, and he was very vague what the New Deal was, and he'd make it up as he went along the whole time. The only specific promises he made were to repeal prohibition, which had become hugely unpopular by this time, and to balance the federal budget, which is actually a fiscally conservative thing to do. In fact, we'd have to wait till after the inauguration to see what the New Deal would really entail. But those are the only two concrete ideas, which really weren't very far from Herbert Hoover. Now I'm going to spend the rest of this lecture and the next lecture talking about the New Deal, but I'm really talking about the first New Deal, or New Deal Part 1. There's going to be a Part 2 coming up. It's the first New Deal is from 1933 to 1935. FDR inherited an economic shambles. Between 1929 and 1932, the industrial production of the U.S. fell by 50%. New investment fell from $16 billion a year to less than $1 billion. More than 100,000 businesses went bankrupt. The banking system hung on the verge of collapse. In 1931 alone, more than 2,000 banks had shut their doors. FDR promised decisive action in what he called the first 100 days, of his presidency, and he delivered. From March through July, FDR persuaded Congress to pass 15 major pieces of legislation to help bankers, farmers, industrialists, workers, homeowners, the unemployed, the hungry. And he also got Congress to repeal prohibition. Whether these laws were helpful or not, they certainly created excitement and hope. By the way, the president, he was the last of the presidents to be inaugurated in March. Because there was such a delay between his election and the inauguration, it had always been a problem, but people realized he especially needed to get to work, that a constitutional amendment ultimately was passed to move the presidential inauguration from March back to January so they could be more effective from the get-go. Let's talk first about what New Deal Part 1, the 100 Days, did in regard to saving the banks. We don't like the banks, but we've got to save them to keep the financial system from collapsing. Same thing that happened a few years ago. That was the first order of business. Several states had already shut their banks. FDR ordered all banks closed for a bank holiday. Let's close the banks to pass some legislation, stabilize them, let people take a breather. He explained this patiently to the American people. Here's a picture of him doing so on the radio. Congress rushed through the Emergency Banking Act that made federal loans available to private banks. The Economy Act came right after that, committed the government to balancing the budget. The budget was about to be thrown out the window. Herbert Hoover had already proposed both these things, so they were fiscally conservative. FDR later pushed through a second Glass-Steagall Act. Now, I mentioned Glass-Steagall before. That was the official act passed in 1932 to kind of create a little bit of inflation. This is the much more famous Glass-Steagall Act, so-called because it has the same players, but it's officially called the Banking Act of 1933. But today, when historians and economists talk about Glass-Steagall, they mean this one, the Banking Act of 33. And what it did is it separated commercial and investment banking. So you can't take Joe Blow depositors' money and invest in the stock market. That was repealed in 1999, curiously, before this latest meltdown. but it seemed a prudent thing at the time. It also created, the Banking Act of 1933, the Federal Depositors Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, protecting deposits up to $5,000. Your bank collapses, you still get your money because your bank paid into an insurance fund to pay in the event of that happening. We also saw the Securities Act of 1933, which eventually would be augmented by the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. Securities means stocks and bonds. Exchange means market. And these two acts finally regulated the stock markets by creating something called the Securities Exchange Commission, a police force to keep stock markets and bond markets from doing crazy things. New Deal Part 1 also was not squeamish, as was Herbert Hoover, about giving money directly to people to create economic stimulus and to alleviate their very difficult situation. FDR understood he had to balance financial prudence with compassion. And so Congress responded to his request in 1933 with the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA. You're going to get a lot of acronyms in the New Deal. And what this did was financed with $500 million to give directly to the poor. He appointed Harry Hopkins, a young reformer, to head it. And Hopkins made a point of giving away $2 million in the first 2 hours. This was, to just homeless people, unemployed people, things like that. Next, he created the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. This put 2 million men to work on environmental projects, like creating trails in national parks. If you've ever gone to a national park, you may see a little plaque by a trail that said, created by the CCC, 1935. They didn't pay well, but it put people to work and put some money in their pockets. Then came the Civil Works Administration, the CWA, also headed by Hopkins, hired 4 million unemployed at $15 a week to work on 400,000 small-scale government projects. Then came the Homeowners Loan Corporation to refinance mortgages directly to people. You're underwater, can't pay your mortgage, your house is worth less than the mortgage. You could go to this government agency to get a new loan to refinance your mortgage on easier terms. All of these direct subsidies to the jobless and troubled homeowners lent credibility to the New Deal and would set the economy on a new course.